Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today's video is guaranteed to raise your level of ambient anxiety by at least a few percentage points, because today we'll be evaluating the likelihood of Morgoth's apocalyptic return into Middle-earth. Apart from its deceptively lighthearted opening chapters, The Lord of the Rings is not a particularly cheery book. But the perilous world Frodo and his companions must navigate resonates with echoes of an even darker past, overshadowed by the presence of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord who makes even Sauron look like an amateur. The Silmarillion tells us that at the end of the First Age, Morgoth was defeated and cast out of Middle-earth for good, but the implicit possibility of his return runs like a dark thread through the rest of Arda's history. This possibility is made explicit in many of Tolkien's early First Age writings, including the material from which The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings emerged. These early drafts of the Silmarillion and related writings included a prophecy about the end of Arda, and while its proposed origins and exact details vary, the gist goes something like this. Someday, when even the Valar have let their vigilance lapse, Morgoth will return to Middle-earth, heralding the final battle which will mark the end of the world, the Dagor-Dagorath. Dead heroes will return to life, the Silmarils will be broken, and the old world will be remade and renewed. Ultimately, we are told Morgoth will again be defeated, with Turin Turambar usually predicted to get the honor of dealing Morgoth his final blow. And honestly, that's fair, given what poor Turin has had to put up with. While some version of the Dagor-Dagorath appears in many examples of Tolkien's earlier work, his later, more experimental writings introduced potential conflicts with some of the details of the story as originally conceived. At this point, Tolkien introduced a statement that if the Valar know anything about the end of Arda Mard, they haven't shared it, which could indicate he was growing hesitant about explicitly foretelling the details of Middle-earth's end. This is the sentiment Christopher Tolkien borrowed to conclude the published Quenta Silmarillion. If any change shall come and the marring be amended, Manwë and Varda may know, but they have not revealed it, and it is not declared in the Dooms of Mondos. Nevertheless, the vision of the battle at the end of Arda, instigated by none other than Morgoth, left a lasting impression. Many details of the published Silmarillion remain quite compatible with the prophecy, and in fact, this version contains some implicit references to it. In Chapter 7 of the Quenta Silmarillion, we read that not until the end, when Feanor shall return who perished ere the sun was made, and sits now in the halls of awaiting and comes no more among his kin, not until the sun passes and the moon falls, shall it be known of what substance the Silmarils were made. At the very end of the Quenta Silmarillion, after describing how Morgoth was shut outside the walls of the world, the narrator tells us, "And a guard is set forever on those walls, and Eärendil keeps watch upon the ramparts of the sky." Which does beg the question of what it is Eärendil is watching for, and what the guards would be guarding against. Even in The Lord of the Rings, we see similar acknowledgments of the idea of Arda's termination, even if the threat of Sauron should be overcome. Aragorn's coronation vow, echoing the words of his ancestor Elendil, is that he will dwell in Gondor unto the ending of the world. Elrond and Arwen face a parting that should endure beyond the ends of the world. Gandalf counsels the Lords of the West that other evils there are that may come, for Sauron is himself but a servant or emissary. And the chant of the Barrow-wight seems to be describing something a bit more fundamental than Sauron's planned military conquest of Eriador. Cold be sleep under stone, never more to wake on stony bed, never till the sun fails and the moon is dead. In the black wind the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie, till the Dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. In my opinion, the teleology inherent to Middle-earth almost requires the concept of some kind of apocalyptic end, however vaguely described or subtly alluded to. The realm of Arda itself is bounded by space and time, and that means it theoretically must have an end just as it had a beginning. In the meantime, Arda's history is often described as a slow process of fading or decay, punctuated by the providential moments of redemption or victory that Tolkien elsewhere described as eucatastrophes. The idea of a final showdown with Morgoth, the prime evil, whose corruption of the world necessarily persists so long as the world itself does, would be a satisfying way to fulfill both these themes. All of this demonstrates that while the prophecy foretelling Morgoth's return at the end of time may not be canonical per se, it was still an influential motif during the process of Middle-earth's creation, and it remains something we should keep in mind when pondering Tolkien's themes and the internal logic of Arda. With that established, let's take a look at how this event might come about. The description of Morgoth's overthrow at the end of the War of Wrath seems pretty final. And while Middle-earth is still troubled by his servants, and by the dark impression his will left on the substance of Arda, Morgoth himself has been notably absent from the goings-on of later ages. The optimistic among us might therefore be tempted to conclude that in defeating Morgoth, the hosts of the West somehow destroyed him. Sadly, it is all too probable that at least some remnant of Morgoth's corrupt personality persists. The High Elves generally accepted as a given that the so-called soul of a rational creature was indestructible, a unique identity which cannot be disintegrated or absorbed into any other identity. The phenomenon of slain elves, and at least one human, returning to embodied life after being killed, does provide some empirical support for this claim. Now, the Ainur, the class of being to which the Valar and Maiar belong, work a little differently. Generally speaking, Ainur can assume the semblance of a body, but are essentially spirits. Still, the Valar's relationship to the world seems analogous to that of Elvish Fear. This condition Iluvatar made, or it is the necessity of their love, that their power should thenceforth be contained and bounded in the world, to be within it forever until it is complete, so that they are its life and it is theirs. Things get more complicated when we are talking about Ainur who have turned to evil. They tend to rely so heavily on their material forms that they eventually become dependent on them. Sauron is slain on multiple occasions, and while his spirit survives the destruction of his bodies, each death imposes limitations on him, some of them permanent. Morgoth's dependency was even more pronounced. Morgoth at the time of the War of the Jewels had become permanently incarnate. For this reason he was afraid, and waged the war almost entirely by means of devices, or of subordinates and dominated creatures. At one point Tolkien specified that his ejection from Arda was a very physical act. He was judged and eventually taken out of the Blessed Realm and executed, that is, killed like one of the incarnates. While this degree of reliance on a physical form is unusual in one of the Ainur, we do see a comparable example, not in Sauron, but in the wizards, or Istari, who were Maiar clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, able to hunger and thirst, and be slain. Of the 5 Istari we have record of, 2 are known to have been killed, Gandalf and Saruman. We know little of Saruman's ultimate fate, but the hobbits see some suggestive imagery after his death. About the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale, shrouded figure it loomed over the hill. But out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. Now, unfortunately, this isn't conclusive one way or another, but Gandalf's death and subsequent return gives us much more to work with. Gandalf reports that after his fight with the Balrog, "Darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time, and I wandered far on roads that I will not tell." On its own, this statement is also pretty vague, but in later letters Tolkien confirmed that Gandalf really died and was changed. He further asserted that since he described passing out of thought and time, Gandalf would have been beyond the reach of the Valar, whose business is only with this embodied world and its time. So it seems that upon his death, Gandalf's spirit was hurled out of Arda and probably even out of Ea itself, before being returned to life. While the experience does change him, his personality and memories remain more or less continuous with his earlier incarnation. So, although Morgoth's defeat and death was undoubtedly catastrophic for him, there's no reason to think it would have ended his very existence. But before we all start frantically arming for his inevitable resurgence, there are still a couple of details we need to account for. If we accept that Morgoth's vengeful spirit is still out there somewhere, we should probably next ask ourselves where exactly he might be. This seems like a stupid question. The Silmarillion tells us he was thrust through the door of night beyond the walls of the world into the timeless void. It turns out that due to Tolkien's chaotic approach to cosmology and idiosyncratic nomenclature, this is a more ambivalent statement than it might seem. Just past the boundaries of Arda lay regions of Ea which are vast beyond the thought of elves and men, often described as the Outer Darkness. This is where Melkor voluntarily retreated after the discomfiting arrival of Tulkas. In his later writings, Tolkien noted that men, and even elves, were prone to conflate the huge distances of the Outer Darkness with the Void, a term that most often describes more of an existential state than it does a location. In the Ainulindalë, the Timeless Void is a place of emptiness, contrasting with the fair regions where Eru and the Ainur dwell, both existing beyond the reaches of Ea, or being. It's worth noting that even before the music of creation, our future dark foe chose to spend a lot of time there. It was while walking alone in the void that Melkor first conceived of those very special thoughts that make him such a very special boy. Still, if Morgoth has been chucked not just out of Arda, but out of Ea entirely, as the Silmarillion seems to suggest, this could pose a significant obstacle to the restoration of his horrible reign. Based on Gandalf's descriptions of his post-mortem experiences, while he probably didn't end up in the Timeless Void, he likely did pass out of Ea upon his death, and he's very clear that he did not return of his own accord. Instead, he was sent back, and Tolkien seemed convinced this could only be achieved through no less authority than Eru Ilúvatar's. There's always a chance, of course, that Eru might eventually decide to send Morgoth back as well, perhaps out of narrative convenience, in a feeble attempt to revive the dying Arda IP. But it's doubtful that the Ainu formerly known as Melkor could arrange his re-entry into being itself all on his own. However, Tolkien proposes it's equally likely that Morgoth didn't pass out of Ea entirely. If Morgoth were indeed thrust into the void, he argued in a late essay, that should mean that he was put outside time and space, outside Ea altogether. But if that were so, this would imply a direct intervention of Eru. It may, however, refer inaccurately to the extrusion or flight of his spirit from Arda. And if Morgoth is merely bobbing around in the outer darkness that surrounds Arda, well, getting back into Arda becomes a lot easier to manage. After all, he's done this at least once before, during Arda's first spring. On that occasion, not only was he able to pass over the walls of night and re-enter Arda with a posse of new friends, he did so without attracting the notice of the rest of the Valar. Only after a persistent and inexplicable corruption comes to their attention do they even begin to suspect anything is afoot. This is the kind of scenario that the Valar seem keen on preventing after the War of Wrath, bidding Eärendil to patrol the sky as a Silmaril-powered watchman and setting a guard against further encroachments. Their caution suggests that the Valar, at least, consider Morgoth's return a credible threat. At this point, I've argued that some remnant of Morgoth most likely exists, and I've considered where he might be in relation to the protected realm of Arda. But even if Morgoth is lying in wait just beyond the bounds of Middle-earth, watching every move its inhabitants make with unquenched envy, that in itself is still no reason to begin the smithying of swords and axes and spears. After all, it's not obvious that Morgoth is in a position to do much of anything anymore, at least of his own conscious volition. Even before the War of Wrath, toward the end of the First Age, Morgoth is not in great shape. He's dispersed so much of his power in seeking the absolute domination of his subjects and territories that he's become bound within his own monstrous physical form. Fingolfin, a mere elf, was able to inflict permanent damage on this body, and that's on top of the burns his impure flesh received from the Silmarils, an experience later described by other sources as a pain unbearable. Mentally, Morgoth's state is described by Tolkien as a nihilistic madness that surpasses even Sauron's worst excesses. And toward the end of the First Age, he is increasingly absorbed by the relatively trivial matters of mundane tyranny. Although largely self-imposed, these physical and psychological wounds had a devastating effect on Morgoth's already skewed sense of self and of reality. It's far from certain that whatever remained of his being after the destruction of his body could even be called a personality. What was then left of him was no longer powerful enough to reclothe itself. Melkor existed almost solely as a desire to possess and dominate matter. It appears that Sauron would have been in a similarly degraded condition after the destruction of the One Ring. Sauron invests the device of the One Ring with so much of his original power that he can be neutralized by the ring's unmaking. This is actually the only way to permanently resolve the threat he poses. In case you missed it, this is kind of the whole point of The Lord of the Rings. The upshot for the people of Middle-earth is that with the destruction of his ring, Sauron has been rendered effectively impotent. His power has been destroyed, and there is no longer any need to worry about him growing in strength or taking a new physical form. Nevertheless, Tolkien suggests that something of his consciousness survives. Gandalf says that if the ring is destroyed, he will be maimed forever, becoming a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but cannot again grow or take shape. After Frodo completes his mission, there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Enormous it reared above the world and stretched out toward them a vast, threatening hand, terrible, but impotent. For even as it leaned over them, a great wind took it, and it was all blown away and passed. And then a hush fell. An eagle brings the triumphant news to Minas Tirith that the realm of Sauron is ended, his tower overthrown and his gates broken, but even the eagle never claims that Sauron himself has been wholly eradicated. This brings us to yet another difference between Sauron's situation and Morgoth's, and this one is deeply unfortunate, because Sauron's power was concentrated in the One Ring, but Morgoth's was dispersed into the very matter of Arda, and that means that as long as Arda exists, so does the greater part of Morgoth's power. Sauron is severely inconvenienced by the loss of his ring, but he's fundamentally fine so long as it exists. For example, even while his ring remains lost, Sauron can still gradually gather his strength and even regenerate a body. Applying this principle to Morgoth results in some alarming possibilities, especially since Morgoth, who was mighty among the Valar, originally had quite a bit more raw power than Sauron. In the same essay I mentioned earlier, Tolkien suggests that Morgoth could, in time, have begun to heal from the damage he suffered during the War of the Jewels. He had been a being of immense potency and life. The dark spirit of Melkor's remainder might be expected, therefore, eventually, and after long ages, to increase again, even, as some held, to draw back into itself some of its formerly dissipated power. It would rest, seek to heal itself, distract itself by other thoughts and desires and devices, but all simply to recover enough strength to return to the attack on the Valar, and to its old obsession. As it grew again, it would become, as it were, a dark shadow, brooding on the confines of Arda, and yearning for it. According to this theory, even if Morgoth currently lacks the ability, or perhaps simply the opportunity, to enter Arda once more, it's all too possible that he might eventually gain enough of his old strength to make the attempt. And in a situation like this, where the fate of Middle-earth is at stake, I think some theorizing about what that attempt might look like is not only defensible, but required. To start with, it seems reasonable to assert that men will likely be involved in Morgoth's return. In matters of doom and destiny, men are the perpetual wild cards, and their gift of death seems tied to a unique ability to escape or transcend Arda. Plus, Tolkien often touches on the theme of Melkorism being an endemic practice among men, due to the mysterious corruption mankind suffered at his hands early in their history, along with the ongoing effects of the Morgoth element in Arda. The abandoned Lord of the Rings sequel, The New Shadow, likely would have centered on one such cult arising during the reign of Eldarion. Another well-known point in Middle-earth's history where the worship of Melkor grew in popularity, with near-apocalyptic consequences, is in the Second Age, toward the end of the Numenorean civilization. And during my voyages through the history of Numenor this past year, I noticed something interesting about descriptions of the cult of Melkor, a trend that might suggest a possible mechanism for Morgoth's return. In the published Akalabeth, Sauron's cousining of Ar-Pharazôn receives only limited elaboration. Sauron turns Ar-Pharazôn to the worship of Melkor with some very specific statements. He denies the existence of Eru, claiming that the Valar have invented him as a gimmick to keep the Numenoreans in line. He goes on to claim that the real supreme power in Arda is Melkor, who the Valar have falsely defamed. But as far as the practical side of things goes, Sauron's arguments are only vaguely described. Melkor will somehow free the Numenoreans from death if they serve him, with said service amounting to making human sacrifices out of Pharazôn's political enemies, something he probably didn't need too much prompting to agree to. The implication, one endorsed in Tolkien's later essays, is that Sauron's theological arguments were entirely fabricated, and merely intended to remove any lingering inhibitions stemming from fear of Eru or the Valar. As a bonus, these arguments would have increased Pharazôn's trust in Sauron, whose urgings would be much more plausible and palatable if he positioned himself as a humble fellow servant of Melkor, rather than as the aspiring god-emperor he truly was. Exactly why human sacrifice should be necessary, or how Melkor was going to free Ar-Pharazôn from death, are never elaborated on. At least, they're never elaborated on in the final Akalabeth. In earlier accounts, Sauron's claims include more practical information, and the line between what is an outright lie and what might have been a half-truth is not drawn as clearly. In the very first sketches of the story of the fall of Numenor, Sauron not only promotes worship of Melkor, but promises that his second coming is at hand. In The Lost Road, Elendil explains, "Now Sauron speaketh openly of Morgoth. He hath prophesied his return. The temple is to be his house, Numenor is to be the seat of the world's dominion." In both places, this claim is quickly challenged, on the grounds that Morgoth could only ever return to Middle-earth as a spirit. And this idea is present elsewhere, such as in the version of the Silmarillion completed shortly before Tolkien began The Lord of the Rings. Here, the return of Morgoth's spirit is even distinguished from the ongoing effects of his prior corruption. The lies that Melkor sowed in the hearts of elves and men are a seed that doth not die, and cannot by the gods be destroyed. Some say also that Morgoth himself has at times crept back, secretly as a cloud that cannot be seen, and yet is venomous, surmounting the walls and visiting the world to encourage his servants and set on foot evil when all seems fair. I don't know about you, but I find even the possibility of Morgoth's disembodied, invisible spirit returning to Arda horrifying enough. In, for instance, The Lost Road, the rulers of Numenor have accepted this possibility and are even actively working toward it. When the King of Numenor confronts Sauron about Melkor's failure to free him from death after years of dutiful barbecuing, Sauron explains that those pesky Valar are preventing the Dark Lord from returning. They ask where is the undying life that Sauron promised them if they would build the temple for Morgoth. The temple is built, but they are grown old. But Sauron foresaw this, and I hear that he declareth that Morgoth's bounty is restrained by the lords, and cannot be fulfilled while they bar the way. Duplicitous as this claim undoubtedly is, it does match the idea of the Valar having to keep watch against Morgoth, and therefore it seems likely to have an element of truth to it. In this version of events, therefore, Ar-Pharazôn's fleet sets out to secure immortality, not just by claiming the benefits of the Undying Lands, but also by actively overthrowing the Valar. This could also provide some justification for the massive, and some would argue disproportionate, response to Ar-Pharazôn's assault on Valinor. Ripping apart the fabric of the planet and sinking an entire nation makes a little more sense when it's the fate of the world at stake, rather than a little extra blood being shed on the formerly white sands of Eldamar. None of these details were ultimately included in the latest version of the Numenor story, but they show that, for a time at least, a much more concrete link existed between Numenor's worship of Melkor and Morgoth's ability to return to Arda. As to the specifics of how that return might yet be achieved, I wouldn't be able to do more than speculate, so instead I pass the question off to you. Do you think that we're meant to believe Morgoth has been permanently neutralized? Or is his reappearance within Arda all too plausible, giving Middle-earth's history a permanent tinge of foreboding? Leave your opinions in the comments, and if you found the video interesting, hit the like button, hard enough to shatter the gates of night. Consider subscribing to let more videos like this suffuse your notifications with their inescapable corruption. I mean, content. Yes, content. Finally, if you want to support the channel directly, find an appreciative audience for terrible Sindarin puns, or enjoy bonus material, you might want to check out the channel's Patreon page by following the link in the description. Thank you to everyone for watching, and special thanks to my current patrons, including Sam Calder, Ward, Seven-Eyed, Rico Mariani, Perhile the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., James A. McCormick, Gandalf the Grey, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, Joel Bion, and Jared Carver. Without your support, this video would not exist.